Now, President Trump continues to choose staff to fill up empty posts in the White House. Now, that's one of his jobs as part of being president. No problem, right? Now, one of the empty seats is the deputy labor secretary. Now, among one of the things that role is involved in is worker protections, right? Now, that's something that's very important. I care about the workers. I want to make sure that they are protected by laws, right? So, again, I think that's very important. Now, Trump, he's decided to pick someone to fill that position. Now, his pick is a man named Patrick Pizzella. Now, like many Trump appointees, Pizzella seems to have an issue with actually representing the views or the mission of the department that he's going to fill. And I'm going to explain. So, I say that he's got a record. Well, what is that record? Well, apparently he has represented employers and even employers with questionable business practices. Now, one of those I'm going to get into detail on, and it has to do with indentured servitude. So almost literal slavery. I'll explain. Now, this is located in the Mariana Islands, right? Now, that is a U.S. territory off the coast of Japan. Now, Mother Jones had a great piece on this. I'm going to put the link in the description, and I urge you to go and read through it. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through a lot of the history about Mr. Pizzella and show you why he's a terrible pick for deputy labor secretary. Now, they start out with email and billing records reviewed by Mother Jones. And this is back between 1996 and 2000. Now, it says that Pizzella and his colleagues had been organizing all-expense-paid trips to the islands for more than 100 members of Congress, their staffers, and conservative thought leaders. When they would get back, Pizzella would help them convince colleagues that the Northern Mariana Islands were, quote, a laboratory of liberty. Now, remember that phrase. That's going to be very important as you get to hear the details of the working conditions in these so-called laboratories of liberty. Okay. Now, if confirmed by the Senate, by the way, Pizzella would be responsible for holding employers accountable, not only in the United States, but in the Mariana Islands as well. So let me give you the background on who this guy is. Now, Pizzella had arrived at the law firm Preston Gates back in 1996. Now, Preston Gates is the law firm that Jack Abramoff worked at as a lobbyist. And we all know who Jack Abramoff is, right? The guy was put in prison for bribery and corruption. Now, he has long since, of course, been released from prison and has actually been speaking out against that same kind of corruption, as well as Bob Ney, who was also involved in this. Now, he's a huge anti-corruption activist. Now, they wrote in an email, Abramoff did, that Pat was, quote, smart, likable, clever, and hardworking, and was a perfect addition to the quickly emerging Team Abramoff. Pizzella immediately started reading up on Abramoff's new lobbying client, the Commonwealth of Northern Mariana Islands. Now, this is a string of 14 tropical islands just north of Guam, with a total population of about 53,000 people. Now, the year before, Abramoff had learned that the CNMI was looking for a lobbyist to fend off more federal control. Now, that's interesting. Now, a little bit of history on the Mariana Islands and why they're actually U.S. territory. Now, during World War II, the islands were under Japanese control until the United States won the Battle of Saipan. Now, that was back in 1944. Now, so we won control of those islands, America did, and after a while, it was kind of in limbo, right, as part of the United Nations Trust. And after a few decades, they opted to join the United States as a commonwealth instead of being an independent nation. And that happened back in 1975. So there's a little history, right? Now, in becoming a commonwealth, they made an agreement with the United States. This agreement granted two exemptions. One, the CNMI would set its own minimum wage. Second, the Commonwealth would be allowed to make its own immigration laws. Now, the CNMI officials initially requested control of the immigration to ensure that the indigenous population would not be overwhelmed by newcomers. So, they're part of America now, and we want to control immigration so we can protect our own people. Okay, I get that, right? Now, unfortunately, there were powerful corporate interests at play that used those immigration laws they found ways to subvert them. Over the next 10 years, garment manufacturers in the CNMI's government decided to use the exemption to import unlimited guest workers to work in the garment industry. Now, they were making clothes for companies like Brooks Brothers and Banana Republic. Now, the clothes they produced were ironically stamped "Made in the USA" and exported to the United States tariff-free. Between 1985 and 1998, CNMI garment exports grew from almost nothing to a total of over $1 billion annually, or over the third of the total CNMI business revenue. So this was big business, right? And this was big business that was made on the backs of poorly paid guest workers from neighboring countries. We're talking China, Indonesia, Vietnam, Bangladesh, all these different countries, right? So let me give you more details now about the conditions for these guest workers. Now, recruiters illegally required many foreign workers to pay fees in order to land jobs at the CNMI, causing them to go into debt that they would have to work to pay off. We have a name for that. That is called indentured servitude. And it is akin to slavery. So already, we're not looking good. Now, there are other things that are even more disastrous, and they're called shadow contracts. Now, in these shadow contracts, people usually promise their employers not only to not unionize, but not to date or practice a religion while working in the CNMI. So you can't even practice your religion. That's disastrous. It gets worse. Some were made to sleep a dozen to a room, with barbed wire surrounding their barracks. If workers complained, the CNMI government, which had close ties to the garment industry, could deport them immediately. So, look, they had these people that were there to, that were only there to try to work hard to feed their families, right? They had these people in these kind of conditions, and they did so because they could, because they had no rights. They were foreign guest workers. So, you've got no rights? So if you bitch, I'm going to send you back to your home country so you can't feed your family anymore. So we keep you in these horrible conditions, but even though we do so, you can't bitch. So basically, this was the extraction of labor. And these companies and the government work together to get rich off exploiting these people. It's absolutely grotesque, right? So that's the working conditions. So what about Abramoff? How does this tie in? Well, here's more details on that. Now, when Abramoff signed the CNMI government as a client back in July of 1995, the U.S. Senate had already unanimously passed a bill to strip the islands of its minimum wage exemption, so they can no longer set their own minimum wage. Now, it was the government of America that can set the minimum wage in that territory, in that Commonwealth. Now, they set up what looked to be an uncontentious vote in the House. Now, the year before, representatives from the Interior and Labor Departments and the U.S. Immigration and Naturalization Service had testified at a Senate hearing about mistreatment of foreign workers. CNMI Governor Froilan Tenorio joined them to say he was disgusted and ashamed by the stories of human rights abuses. Unfortunately, he added at the hearing, they are generally accurate. So they're not denying this. They're saying, yeah, we bring in these guest workers, we treat them like shit, and we make money off their backs. And yet, the workers continue to come there, right? According to a 1998 federal government report, indentured alien workers, mostly from Bangladesh, China, and the Philippines, made up 91% of the CNMI's private sector workforce. The majority of citizens, on the other hand, worked in better paid government jobs. Immigration laws that were supposed to protect the CNMI's indigenous population had made many citizens into overlords who are now outnumbered by their guest workers. So look, remember the original reason that they had these immigration laws, so they were not overrun by foreigners. Well, now they're overrun by foreigners who are now doing the worst jobs imaginable and being treated in the worst way imaginable. So, ironically, the people who were there before, well, they actually got the better end of the stick, which is very interesting. Now, Tenorio argued that the CNMI could fix the problems without eliminating those exemptions. Remember, the exemptions on immigration and the minimum wage, which was still being set up in the House and had been passed in the Senate. Now, there are other lobbyists, Abramoff wrote in his memoir, told Tenorio that preserving them was a lost cause, so they wanted to get rid of these exemptions. Abramoff disagreed. To save them, he wrote, he told the governor's chief of staff that the CNMI just needed to convince the conservatives running Congress that the fight was about defending what they called a free market. In the 1995 pitch letter to Tenorio, Abramoff argued that personal tours could help sway public officials. Pizzella was the man who led this effort. By his second month on the job, Pizzella was spending more than 100 billable hours per month on the CNMI account, about as much as Jack Abramoff. The centerpiece of Pizzella's work was organizing all-inclusive junkets for members of Congress and their wives, congressional staffers, and conservative influencers, such as, and you'll love this, pollster Kellyanne Fitzpatrick, who now goes by the name Kellyanne Conway. So she's in this too, and advises President Donald Trump with first-class airfare and lodging at the beachfront Hyatt Regency on Saipan. Pat's very effective, according to a former consultant to the CNMI, talking to the New Republic back in 2001. Visitors to the island seem to get all the right information. Now, Pizzella's first trip was back in 1996. He was in this junket. Now, this included meetings with the governor and the Saipan Garment Manufacturers Association, as well as a tour of a garment factory. Some later trips included meetings with human rights activists. So, you got to keep up appearances, right? Later that year, Abramoff wrote in an email to Herman Guerrero, a CNMI official, that the recent congressional staff trips had done more good for the CNMI than almost anything that we have done in the past. After they got back, they wrote Clint Bullock, a co-founder for the Institute for Justice, which is a libertarian public interest law firm, reported shortly after returning that the CNMI boasted perhaps the most vibrant economy in the United States. What was their secret? Unregulated markets that they said in 2 decades have created out of almost nothing head-spinning economic growth, productivity, and prosperity. And of course, that prosperity, as I mentioned, was built on the backs of the exploitation of foreign workers. Now, Bullock, who is now a state Supreme Court justice in Arizona, and others were particularly impressed that Governor Tenorio supported conservative priorities like school vouchers. So this is, like I said, a conservative paradise. The year before, Pizzella had discussed vouchers and a flat tax with the Conservative Heritage Foundation and the Cato Institute on behalf of the CNMI's government. Our travelers ate this up, Abramoff wrote in his memoir. The conservative groups in Washington had found a new hero in this Democratic governor of our least populated territory. Now, there was another tactic that they used to try to gain support. Now, they had the CNMI funnel money to a front group in order to pay for these junkets. Now, why would they do that? Well, they wanted to make sure that the junkets appeared to be independent. Before one of them, Preston Gates' billing records show, Pizzella met with Amy Moritz, who is the president for the National Center for Public Policy Research. Now, that's a conservative group that funded several trips for Abramoff. Now, they went there to discuss a CNMI trip and possible funding arrangements. Now, after he returned, Pizzella explained in an email to Abramoff how a report by Cato fellow Doug Bandow would be paid for. So here's that. That leaves basically the fees for Bandow's services and report, and the reimbursement for the bills accumulated. Pizzella wrote to Abramoff, that should come to about $10,000. That is the amount CNMI should provide as a grant to the NCPPR. Then that company can now cut a check to Bandow for that exact amount. So here's that government giving this group, right, this National Center for Public Policy Research, this front group, $10,000 to then pay for the guy who went on this trip, to the lobbyist, right? Preston Gates' billing records include an $8,000 invoice for Bando's trip, expenses that lists the NCPPR as the vendor. And of course, after the trip, Bando started writing a report for the Competitive Enterprise Institute, which is a libertarian think tank. Pizzella had about a dozen discussions with Bando and Marla Lewis, a CEI executive, about the report, and according to billing records, as the publication date got closer, Pizzella, Abramoff, and Michael Susan, a junior Preston Gates lobbyist, also edited and provided comments on drafts. The final report, called the CNMI, a Center for Policy Innovation and Laboratory of Liberty, that could serve as a model for the rest of the country. That's what they called this. That model is what they want for the rest of the country. A permanent underclass of foreign guest workers who are paid terribly and oftentimes indentured servants. That's their model for economic growth. And of course, they get to that point by destroying labor laws, deregulating markets, and of course, as I said, importing a massive amount of foreign workers who they mistreat in hideous ways. That is their plan. That's what they want to do. That's the conservative economic plan. If it's not clear enough, Susan wrote in a memoir, quote, "The point of my presence at the scene was to help these factory owners get away with exploitation." That's pretty clear. They knew. They knew. And they did not give a shit. Now, he also wrote that Pat, the team leader of the congressional delegation, put a spin on it, saying, quote, "See, working conditions are not as horrible as the press would have us believe. On the way out, he recalled, they got a special treat. This kind of clothes." Now, Susan apparently felt bad about this. Now, listen to this quote, and this is kind of haunting. He said, "The pride I felt for my job at that moment made me want to put a bullet through my head." They knew. They knew. They knew what they were doing. Now, of course, after that whole thing, eventually Abramoff moved to a different firm. Now, he still lobbied on behalf of the CNMI. However, Pizzella, he had joined the Bush administration, and apparently he had no qualms about this. Now, by that time, hundreds of congressmen had went on these junkets and tours to rack up support for basically their exploitation racket, right? Abramoff, of course, later on served prison time for that corruption, that bribery. But make no mistake, Pat Pizzella, while he wasn't one of the people that were arrested for any of that corruption, what he did for the CNMI as a lobbyist was bad enough. And unfortunately, that kind of exploitation was legal. And not only that, but he had normalized this kind of anti-worker climate in that area. So this is the kind of person who will be in charge of protecting American workers. This is who they're going to go to protect workers, right? Now, look, I'm not saying he'll definitely screw American workers, but he seems to have no qualms about screwing over other workers and deregulating markets and killing labor laws, okay? This guy seems to have a lack of moral fiber, which makes him perfect for the Trump administration. Look, if the Senate confirms this guy, which could happen in several ways, for example, all Republicans vote for him and Mike Pence basically breaks the tie, like they did with Betsy DeVos, or even if some of the Democrats go to support him, well, look, then we know what kind of exactly those people think about regular working people and about the conditions in the CNMI. Hey everybody, thanks for watching this video. If you want to see more like this, please hit the subscribe button below. And if you want to support truly independent progressive media, please consider becoming a patron. at patreon.com/TYTNation.